Hi, Section 112. It's Miss Smith, and this is part 1 of our Week 11 lecture on sentence structure. First, I have a couple of announcements. You have a discussion post and a short assignment to do this week. They're two separate things, so don't get them mixed up. There are already examples of how to do both on Blackboard, but let me know if you need help. You also have access to your textbooks for free now. They're ebooks on the publisher site or just a PDF depending on which book you need. The Carolina Rhetoric is a lot easier because it's just a PDF, but if you need access to the Everyday Writer, you can log on and make an account with the publisher and read the ebook online for free. It's pretty cool, but it's a little bit complicated to make the account, so let me know if you need help. Also, I wanted to remind you to be working on your research paper. That due date is going to hit you pretty soon, and you'll need to have a significant amount of it done the week before for peer review. Okay, now I'm going to explain why sentence structure even matters for this class. Going forward, I'm going to hit you with a lot of vocabulary words and a lot of grammatical stuff that you either will feel like you've already covered in grade school or you'll feel like it's too complicated to mess with. But it is important for us to have a shared vocabulary so that I can correct your sentences properly. You might have heard this lecture before if you were in my English 101 class, and that's fine. You probably have a little bit of an advantage over your classmates because this lecture is a little bit more dynamic in person. But I do this lecture in both classes because sentence structure is really important for rhetoric. The structure of a sentence can affect its meaning, it can affect your argument. You can use the order of a sentence to emphasize certain things, make certain things more subtle, and guide your reader through your argument. Sentence structure also affects ethos, pathos, and logos, because if you are consistently writing sentences incorrectly, that affects your ethos, your reader's sense of your own authority. You can also use sentence structure to maximize the emotional impact of something. You can also use sentence structure to guide people through your logic or your logos. But despite all that, I want to remind you that complicated sentences are not necessary. The important thing about sentence structure is clarity. I and almost everyone who will ever read your writing, including potential employers, employees, would much rather read sentences that seem less complex but are easy to understand than sentences that are so complicated that it affects our comprehension. So keep that in mind, that when I say ethos is affected by sentence structure, I don't mean if you don't sound smart, no one will listen to you. I mean if people can't understand you, they won't listen to you. So keep things simple. That's completely fine. So in this lecture, I'm going to be telling you the 3 most common types of sentence mistakes and how to fix them. But before we do that, we have to be on the same page about all this vocabulary, what's a subject, what's a predicate, that kind of thing. I'm going to go over it pretty quickly because I'll assume that most of you have either taken extensive English language classes or have learned this in American schools. So I'm just going to go over it real fast. So a subject is the main noun or pronoun in the sentence. But I want to remind you that it is not the noun that best expresses the idea of the sentence. It's the noun that grammatically or functionally performs the action or is being described. So, for example, the sentence, "I think that umbrellas are useless," is clearly a sentence about umbrellas. Like, umbrellas are the main idea of that sentence, but I is the subject because it's performing the action think. The subject is always going to be a noun or a pronoun, but watch out for gerunds or other abstractions. Basically, those are verbs that end in ing that can act like nouns. I'll show you some of those later. So just to recap for that slide, the noun or pronoun that is performing the action or being described is the subject. The main idea is a completely different thing. Sometimes the subject and the main idea are the same thing, but not always, and very rarely in college level writing. This is just a slide that I provided in case you get subjects and objects confused. I won't be asking you about subjects and objects, but I did want to give you this slide for context. Basically, what I want you to know from that is that sentences can have many nouns in them, but every clause only has one subject. Sometimes that subject is a compound subject, but it's still only one subject. Right? Objects are also nouns in sentences, but usually they receive action or are part of the description. If somebody asks you what a simple subject is, that's really just the one most important noun. So for example, in this sentence, Trevor's brother lives in California. The simple subject is just the one noun brother, but for the full subject, we'd need to know whose brother, so Trevor's brother. Compound subjects are when there are two people doing an action, or two things doing an action, or two people or things being described. I do want you to know, since you're writing sentences at the college level and they often have more than one clause in them, that each clause does have its own subject, so you can have a compound subject in one clause and another subject in another clause, all in the same sentence. The reason I even go over this at all is because it is so crucial to know what your subject is to be able to even identify a sentence mistake. In my experience, students have been able to figure out when their sentences quote unquote sound wrong, but haven't been able to describe what's wrong with them, and it all comes back to not being able to identify the subject. So, again, subject is the noun that performs the action or is described, but I wanted to show you these tricky ones. Running and studying are technically, if somebody just asked you what is the word running, you would probably say verb. However, because it's got an ing at the end and it's being talked about as a concept and being described as a concept, it does function as a noun in this sentence, and so it is the subject. Those are very sneaky words, but they're used a lot in college level sentences, so I wanted to remind you about it. So the companion to the subject is always the predicate. You may also hear it called the verb in the sentence. You will hear me use both. They mean essentially the same thing. And since this is not a grammar class, it doesn't really matter how specific you are about it. The verb of the sentence is the verb that connects the subject to the action somehow. So it either is the action word or it's the word that links the noun to the description. Again, there are often many verbs in sentences, but only the ones that are directly related to the subject count as the predicate, and again, verb and predicate are often interchangeable terms. Basically, the only real difference is that verb is often the simple predicate, or the one word that initiates the subject's action or description, and the predicate is usually like the whole rest of the sentence. So for example, if we've got Kate poured the tea, the verb is going to be poured, but the predicate is going to be everything, both the verb and the object, I think. Yeah, I think that's the object, what she poured. There's also such a thing as compound and complex predicates. You are almost always going to be writing with compound and complex predicates. That means there's more than one action going on, or you're adding more than one description. When you're writing at the college level, you're almost always going to have one that's a little more complicated. So my examples here are Kate poured the tea and burned her finger, and singing is a very old tradition and was my favorite thing to do when I was a kid. So the reason I wanted you to see these is because they are not in danger of becoming one of our sentence mistakes that I'll show you in the next lecture, because both predicates, poured the tea and burned her finger, are connected to the same subject, and there's not a second subject in there floating around that makes two clauses. Alright, so in our next video, we'll explain phrases and clauses, and then get started on the common sentence mistakes. So before we move on, I want you to go back, practice and make sure that you really can understand where your subjects and your predicates are, because if you can't identify them, you will not be able to identify mistakes. All right, see you in the next video.